What if the fate of a kingdom could hinge not on the clash of swords, nor the cunning of kings, but on something as ordinary, as foolishly mundane as a plate of food? How could the death of one man, brought about not by assassins or battlefield wounds, but by a supper of lampreys, plunge England into one of the darkest civil wars of the Middle Ages? And why did a king, whose iron will had shaped a realm, ignore every warning, every plea, and choose indulgence over survival? This is the story of King Henry I of England, son of the mighty William the Conqueror, ruler of an uneasy realm whose strange and stubborn death in 1135 did not simply end a life. It cracked open the fragile shell of royal authority, sending the kingdom spiralling into decades of chaos that chroniclers would call the Anarchy. The evening was cold, the winds off the Norman coast biting with a damp chill, when Henry's court gathered for a feast at Saint-Denis-le-Fermont. The king was old now, past 60, remarkable in an age when most men of power perished long before. His hair was streaked with grey, his body still thick with the weight of command, but his eyes burned with the same calculating sharpness that had brought him through decades of war and intrigue. But on this night, as silver platters were laid upon the long tables, Henry ignored the politics that usually consumed him. He ignored the counsel of his physicians, the cautious words of his courtiers. Instead, he fixed his attention upon a delicacy he adored with almost childlike obsession: lampreys. Slippery, eel-like fish swimming in rivers and seas, lampreys were to Henry what wine was to a drunkard, or dice to a gambler, irresistible, even dangerous. His doctors had begged him to abstain. The rich, oily flesh was ruinous for his aging stomach. But Henry was no man to be told no. The chronicler Henry of Huntingdon describes it with brutal simplicity. The king ate a surfeit of lampreys, of which he always felt an aversion, but for which he had a most unrestrained appetite. Imagine the hall lit with flickering torches, shadows stretching across the stone walls. Courtiers laugh nervously, bishops sip their wine. And there, at the high table, the king devours plate after plate, his jaw set in stubborn pleasure, as if each bite were an act of defiance against his own mortality. Hours later, the pain began. At first, it was a discomfort he could dismiss. Henry was used to hardship. He had endured campaigns in snow and mud, had survived rebellions and treachery. But this was different. Sharp, twisting, relentless agony gripped his belly. His body, so long a fortress, was betraying him from within. For days he lingered, writhing, issuing commands between fits of torment. Priests were summoned, last words spoken, heirs and counsellors gathered in tense circles. And then, on the night of the 1st of December, 1135, the king who had ruled England with ruthless efficiency, the last son of William the Conqueror, died in his chamber, not by sword, not by poison, but by lamprey. But the true story is not his death alone, for in that moment of indulgence and stubbornness, Henry left behind a kingdom unprepared, a throne contested, and a legacy that would unravel into one of England's most shocking civil wars. What happens when a king dies without a clear heir? When ambition, betrayal, and bloodlines collide? The answer, as we shall see, is nothing less than anarchy. To understand why the death of King Henry I tore England apart, we must first step back into his reign, into the story of how the youngest son of William the Conqueror, a man never expected to wear the crown, seized it with cunning, held it with steel, and ruled longer than any Norman king before him. Henry was not born to be king. His elder brothers, Robert Curthose and William Rufus, inherited the lion's share of their father's empire after the Conqueror's death in 1087. Robert took Normandy, the ancestral homeland across the Channel. William claimed England, the jewel of conquest. And Henry? He received money, £5,000 of silver, a consolation prize for a prince deemed unlikely to rule. But Henry was no idle younger son. Educated, sharp-tongued, patient in ambition, he bided his time. Fate intervened when his brother William Rufus died suddenly in a hunting accident in 1100, an arrow loosed in the New Forest that struck the king dead. Some whispered it was no accident. Henry moved swiftly. Within days, he raced to Winchester, seized the treasury, and had himself crowned at Westminster Abbey. From the start, Henry ruled with a mix of charm and ruthlessness. He issued a charter of liberties to appease his barons, promising good governance and restraint. But behind those promises lay iron resolve. Rebellion flared, and Henry crushed it. Robert Curthose, returning from crusade and pressing his own claim, was defeated at the Battle of Tinchebray in 1106. Henry took Normandy, imprisoned his brother for life, and made himself master of both sides of the Channel. For 3 decades he reigned. Chroniclers called him Lion of Justice. He strengthened royal courts, tightened administration, and filled his coffers. He was not loved, but he was feared, and in that fear lay stability. Yet, Henry's greatest obsession was not conquest or law, it was succession. He had many illegitimate children, more than 20 by various mistresses. But his legitimate heir, William Adelin, was his pride, the son destined to secure the Norman dynasty. And then, in 1120, catastrophe struck. William Adelin, young and reckless, set sail across the Channel in the White Ship. A vessel filled with the sons and daughters of the nobility. Wine flowed freely, laughter echoed, sails caught the wind. But the ship struck a rock and capsized. Nearly everyone drowned, including the heir to the throne. The wails of mothers and the despair of lords spread like wildfire. The dynasty's future was shattered in a single night. Henry, it is said, never smiled again. From then on, his reign was shadowed by anxiety. With no son to succeed him, he turned to his daughter, Matilda, the widow of the Holy Roman Emperor, remarried to Geoffrey of Anjou. He demanded his barons swear oaths to recognize her as his heir. They did so reluctantly, muttering behind closed doors. A woman, and married to a man of Anjou, their loyalty was lukewarm at best. Still, Henry clung to this fragile plan. His power held the realm together, but it was a kingdom balanced on a knife's edge. And so, when he sat down to that fatal feast of lampreys in 1135, his death did not simply end a long reign. It toppled the delicate scaffolding of succession, plunging England into a struggle that would pit cousin against cousin, noble against noble, and plunge the land into near 2 decades of civil war. Imagine it. A cold November night in 1120, the port of Barfleur in Normandy, alive with the clamour of laughter, music, and drunken revelry. The White Ship, the pride of the fleet, stood ready to cross the Channel. It was no ordinary voyage. Aboard were the sons and daughters of England's nobility, the flower of the Norman elite, and at their centre William Adelin, the only legitimate son of King Henry I, heir to both England and Normandy. The ship itself was a marvel. Sleek, swift, and crewed by the best sailors of the age, it was said to cut the waters like a blade. Its master boasted he would overtake the king's own vessel and reach England first. Spirits were high, wine flowed without measure, and the young nobles, some barely into adulthood, drank deeply, heedless of caution. By all accounts, the company was wild. Jests rang out, goblets clinked, and torches flickered as the tide pulled outward. A priest, asked to bless the ship, refused after seeing the drunken chaos. His warning went unheeded. The anchor was lifted, the sails unfurled, and with laughter still echoing, the White Ship slipped into the black waters of the Channel. Moments later, tragedy struck. Barely out of the harbour, the ship smashed against a hidden rock. The hull split open, cold seawater surged in, and panic erupted. Nobles screamed, sailors scrambled, torches extinguished in the rushing tide. The vessel, heavy with bodies and drink, listed and sank with horrifying speed. William Adelin managed to scramble into a small boat. Safety, it seemed, was within reach. But then he heard the cries of his half-sister, Matilda the Countess of Perche, calling out for help amidst the chaos. Against the frantic urging of his companions, William turned back to save her. The boat, overloaded with desperate survivors, capsized. In an instant, the hope of a dynasty was swallowed by the sea. Only one man survived, a butcher from Rouen, clinging to wreckage until dawn. Through him, the world learned the tale of the White Ship. Nearly 300 souls perished that night, including the cream of Norman aristocracy. But it was the death of William Adelin that echoed loudest, reverberating across courts and kingdoms. When the news reached King Henry, chroniclers wrote that he collapsed in grief. "Never again did he smile," said William of Malmesbury, a historian of the time. The king was inconsolable. His son, the promise of his line, the linchpin of his succession, was gone. The consequences were catastrophic. With William dead, Henry had no male heir. His only surviving legitimate child was his daughter, Matilda. The barons swore oaths to recognize her as queen, but beneath their vows lurked doubt, resentment, and disdain. A woman ruling England was an idea few could accept. Thus, the White Ship disaster was more than a maritime tragedy. It was the moment England's fate was unmoored. One reckless night of drunken revelry had drowned the future of a kingdom, and with it the fragile peace Henry had built. Unseen beneath the waves that swallowed the White Ship lay the seeds of chaos seeds that would burst into civil war upon the king's death. What kills a king? An assassin's dagger? A battlefield wound? The slow rot of age? For Henry I, son of William the Conqueror, it was none of these. Instead, his end came from something as humble as a fish. By 1135, Henry was old, weary, and marked by grief. The death of his only son aboard the White Ship 15 years earlier still haunted him. Chroniclers said he never truly recovered, that a shadow lingered in his eyes. Yet Henry was no weak monarch. He had ruled England with iron discipline, crushing rebellions, marrying alliances, and weaving a fragile stability between Norman lords and Anglo-Saxon subjects. But fate is cruel. In December of that year, while in Normandy, Henry indulged in one of his favourite delicacies, lampreys. These eel-like fish, slippery and strange, were a luxury of medieval tables, adored by nobles for their rich, earthy taste. Physicians, however, often warned against them, claiming they were difficult to digest. Henry, stubborn as ever, ignored the advice. He ate his fill too much, some said. Soon after, he fell violently ill. Fever, cramps, and agonizing pain racked his body. His courtiers whispered in dread. The king was dying, not from sword or sin, but from a gluttonous feast of lampreys. For days he lingered, his body weakening, his breath shallow. Around him, nobles already began scheming. Who would inherit? His only legitimate child was his daughter, Matilda. Henry had made his barons swear, more than once, to recognize her as his heir. Yet oaths made in life often crumble at the moment of death. On the 1st of December, Henry I of England breathed his last in the castle of Lyons-la-Forêt. He had ruled for 35 years, one of the longest reigns in Norman history. His body, embalmed in salt and wrapped in a bull's hide to preserve it, was carried across the Channel to be buried at Reading Abbey, the monastery he had founded. But it was not his corpse that mattered now, it was the crown he left behind. Matilda, his chosen heir, was strong-willed, intelligent, and determined. Yet she was a woman in a world that trusted only men to wield power. Worse still, she was married to Geoffrey Plantagenet, Count of Anjou, a rival house despised by many Norman barons. To them, the thought of bending the knee to a woman, tied to a hated foreigner, was intolerable. Opportunity breeds ambition, and Henry's nephew, Stephen of Blois, saw his chance. Swift and cunning, he sailed to England before Matilda could act. With the support of powerful nobles and the blessing of the church, Stephen seized the throne and was crowned king. It was a betrayal of oaths, a usurpation, and the spark that lit the long, bloody struggle known as the Anarchy. The death of Henry I was more than the end of a king. It was the shattering of fragile order, the collapse of promises sworn on sacred relics, and the beginning of nearly 2 decades of civil war. And all because of lampreys, a king's indulgence, a feast turned fatal. History remembers Henry not for the empire he held together, but for the dinner that undid it all. What is loyalty worth when ambition whispers in your ear? What becomes of oaths sworn before God when the crown of England lies unguarded, waiting for the boldest hand to seize it? When Henry I died in December 1135, his daughter Matilda should have inherited the throne. Every baron had sworn fealty to her, many of them more than once, their hands pressed to holy relics as they pledged to honour her claim. But in the cold reality of power, promises proved lighter than air. Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew and grandson of William the Conqueror, wasted no time. As news of the king's death spread, he raced across the Channel, landing at Dover in a storm. While Matilda lingered in Anjou, Stephen acted. He rode hard for London, presenting himself as the man destined to keep the realm stable. The timing could not have been more fortuitous. The English barons, weary of uncertainty, feared the prospect of a queen ruling in her own right. Worse still, Matilda was married to Geoffrey of Anjou, a man they despised as a rival and enemy. To them, recognizing Matilda meant bowing not only to a woman, but to the Plantagenet house, something they could not stomach. Stephen, on the other hand, was charming, affable, and already popular among the nobility. He promised peace, stability, and above all, the defence of their privileges. With bribes, assurances, and a flood of charisma, he won their support. But Stephen knew that power was nothing without legitimacy. For that, he needed the church. And here fortune smiled on him once more. His brother, Henry of Blois, was none other than the Bishop of Winchester and papal legate in England. Henry threw the full weight of the church behind his brother's claim. Before the year was out, Stephen was crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey, the sacred oil dripping from his brow as if heaven itself approved. For Matilda, the news was a thunderclap. She had been betrayed not just by her cousin, but by nearly every lord who had once knelt before her. To her, this was more than treachery. It was a theft of destiny. She was not merely Henry's child, she was his chosen heir. The throne was hers by right, and Stephen had stolen it. Her outrage burned into resolve. She would not bow, she would not yield, and she would not forget. From Anjou, she began to muster support. Her husband Geoffrey waged campaigns along Normandy's borders, harassing Stephen's lands. Meanwhile, Matilda turned to her half-brother, Robert of Gloucester, one of the most powerful magnates in England. Robert's loyalty would prove decisive. His armies, wealth, and influence would become the backbone of Matilda's claim. And so the stage was set. England had 2 monarchs, one crowned by the church and cheered by nobles, the other born of rightful blood and sworn by oaths. It was only a matter of time before words gave way to war. The usurpation of Stephen was not just an opportunistic coup. It was the breaking of bonds between king and vassal, between man and God, and between cousins bound by family. Once broken, those bonds could never be mended. The question was no longer who should rule, but who could hold the kingdom, and at what cost. How fragile is a crown when it rests upon uncertain loyalty? How quickly can a realm, sworn to stability, collapse into blood and fire when 2 claimants demand obedience? Stephen had his coronation. He had the support of nobles, bishops, and even the Pope. Yet power seized in haste is power that must constantly be defended. The ink on his charters was hardly dry when cracks began to show in his rule. Matilda, though absent from England, was not silent. Her letters flew across the Channel, carried by loyal messengers, reminding barons of their oaths. She was not merely a woman seeking power, she declared she was the rightful heir, anointed by her father's command. To break faith with her was to break faith with the king who had made England strong. Her greatest weapon, however, was not parchment but blood. Robert of Gloucester, her half-brother, cast off all pretense of neutrality. His defection to Matilda's cause in 1138 sent shockwaves through the realm. Robert commanded vast estates, wealth, and men. His loyalty transformed Matilda from a dispossessed claimant into a genuine threat. Stephen moved quickly to crush rebellion. He marched north to confront the Scots, for King David I. Matilda's maternal uncle had invaded England under the guise of protecting her rights. The two armies clashed at the Battle of the Standard near Northallerton. It was a brutal encounter, banners of saints and relics borne aloft by English troops as if heaven itself fought on their side. Stephen's forces triumphed, beating back the Scots, and for a moment his crown seemed secure. But victories on one front could not secure peace everywhere. In the southwest, Robert of Gloucester stirred revolt. Castles, those stone fangs of medieval warfare, became the true prize. Whoever held them controlled the land, the villages, and the roads. One by one, fortresses turned into battlegrounds. Some were besieged for months, their garrisons starving behind walls, while armies camped outside in mud and smoke. England began to fracture. The loyalty of barons shifted like the tide, bought with bribes, threatened by force, or seduced by promises of favour. Betrayals multiplied. Entire counties became no man's land, where robber knights plundered peasants, churches were pillaged, and famine spread like shadow. Chroniclers wrote with horror, "Christ and his saints slept." Stephen himself was valiant but inconsistent. He was brave in battle, generous to his followers, yet indecisive in judgment. He sought to be a king of mercy when England demanded a king of iron. When traitors betrayed him, he forgave too easily. When nobles seized castles, he hesitated instead of crushing them. Slowly, respect turned to doubt, and doubt to contempt. Meanwhile, Matilda's voice grew louder. From across the sea, she gathered strength, preparing for the moment when she would set foot upon English soil. Her allies urged her onward. The time had come to seize what had been stolen. The anarchy had begun in earnest. It was not a clean war of armies and banners, but a dirty war of sieges, raids, and betrayals. Villages burned, families starved, priests lamented. And yet, amidst this chaos, two rival monarchs loomed: Stephen, crowned but precarious, and Matilda, dispossessed but determined. England was no longer a kingdom at peace. It was a prize, contested with sword and fire, its fate balanced on the edge of uncertainty. The storm had only just begun. What happens when a ghost becomes flesh? For years, Matilda had been a name whispered in letters, invoked in oaths, claimed as a symbol. But in the autumn of 1139, the dispossessed empress crossed the Channel and set foot upon English soil. The long-awaited rival to Stephen was no longer a rumour. She was here, and she meant to fight. Her arrival was bold, even reckless. With her half-brother Robert of Gloucester at her side, she landed at Arundel on the southern coast. Chroniclers speak of her disembarking not in the trappings of royalty, but in dignity nonetheless, cloaked, determined, her eyes fixed on the horizon of a kingdom she still claimed as her birthright. Behind her came men-at-arms, seasoned fighters loyal to Robert and to the cause of their rightful queen. The reaction was immediate. To Stephen, this was no minor rebellion to be crushed. It was the embodiment of the very threat he had long feared. He gathered his forces and marched south with haste, intent on surrounding Matilda before her cause could grow. His banners flew, his knights thundered along the muddy roads, and the shadow of siege fell upon Arundel. But fate did not play as he expected. Inside Arundel Castle, Matilda found a surprising protector, Adeliza of Louvain, the widow of King Henry I, her stepmother. Adeliza granted her refuge, not out of politics, but perhaps out of duty, kinship, or conscience. Stephen soon realized that to storm Arundel would be to stain himself with the dishonour of attacking the Queen Dowager's household. So, in a move both chivalrous and naive, Stephen allowed Matilda to depart Arundel under escort, sending her north to join Robert of Gloucester. Some later said this was folly, that he had let the wolf escape the snare. Others argued it was mercy, a kingly act that befitted his character. Either way, the result was the same. Matilda was free, and her claim now had flesh, voice, and presence in England itself. Once reunited with Robert, her banner was unfurled. No longer could her enemies dismiss her as an absent claimant. She summoned barons, negotiated alliances, and began to build a court in exile. Around her gathered men of ambition and conviction, nobles disillusioned by Stephen's indecision, clerics uneasy with his leniency, and soldiers hungry for glory. The chroniclers, ever quick to shape legend, began to describe her in stark, unforgettable terms. She was not the soft figure of medieval femininity that many expected. She was imperious, commanding, proud. Some said haughty, others said regal. To her followers, she was every inch the empress. To her detractors, she was arrogant and unnatural. But one thing was clear: she was formidable. From this moment forward, England was no longer merely in rebellion, it was in civil war. Two courts, two monarchs, in fact, if not in name, stood opposed. Castles became strongholds of faction, families split down the middle, and the land itself trembled beneath the uncertainty. The Empress had returned. Her presence transformed the war from skirmishes and sieges into a struggle for the very soul of the crown. The pieces were set upon the board. Now it would be king against empress, steel against steel, until one was cast down. The duel for England had truly begun. What does a kingdom look like when its crown is uncertain? When no man, no village, no castle can know whose law holds sway. For nearly a decade, England became a realm torn in two, a wasteland of shifting banners, shattered loyalties, and endless sieges. Chroniclers would later call it the Anarchy, and they did not choose the word lightly. Stephen and Matilda waged their war not as sweeping campaigns across wide plains, but as a grinding struggle of fortresses and attrition. Castles, the steel teeth of medieval power, became the battlegrounds. Each was a miniature kingdom, a lord's seat, a garrison's lair, a farmer's oppressor. One after another was besieged, starved, stormed, or surrendered as rival claimants tightened and loosened their grip upon the land. The common people bore the weight of it most. Monks recorded with bitterness that Christ and his saints slept during those years. Villages were burned by roving mercenaries, fields stripped bare by armies passing through. Famine and fear ruled as much as sword and lance. Where Stephen's banner flew one week, Matilda's standard might rise the next. Allegiances shifted not out of loyalty, but survival. In the midst of this chaos, Matilda proved herself no passive figurehead. She rode with her forces, her presence inspiring loyalty and resolve. Chroniclers described her as sharp-tongued, uncompromising, yet undeniably courageous. When nobles hesitated, she commanded. When soldiers faltered, she reminded them of God's will and her father's promise. Her half-brother Robert of Gloucester remained her sword-arm, the brilliant captain to her imperious command. But Stephen was no mere shadow. He fought fiercely, marching tirelessly across the kingdom to stamp out rebellion. Yet his greatest weakness lay not in battle, but in politics. Time and again, he squandered opportunities by leniency, pardoning rebels instead of crushing them. His magnanimity won him little loyalty. It only allowed his enemies to rise again. Then came the clash that would mark the height of the war, the Battle of Lincoln, February 1141. Stephen, rash and headstrong, hurled himself into combat against Matilda's forces. The fight raged amidst icy winds and churned mud. The king fought like a knight of old, breaking spears and swinging his sword until it snapped in his hand. Surrounded, battered, and unbowed, he stood alone as his followers melted away. Captured, bound, and dragged from the field, Stephen was carried off as a prisoner. For a moment, it seemed the tide had turned forever. With Stephen in chains, the crown lay open for Matilda. She entered Winchester and later London in triumph, hailed as Lady of the English. Bells rang, banners flew, and for the first time since her father's death, it seemed the promise of 1126 might be fulfilled. And yet, power is more fragile than victory. Matilda's iron will, which had driven her this far, would soon prove her undoing. She had defeated her rival in battle, but could she master the art of ruling hearts? The war had not ended. The crown still trembled upon its stand, and in the shadows of triumph, betrayal, and downfall waited. Victory can be a dangerous crown to wear, for when Matilda, triumphant after the capture of King Stephen, entered London in the summer of 1141, the city bells rang, the nobles knelt, and the people craned to see the woman who would be queen. She was called Domina Anglorum, Lady of the English. At last, it seemed, the promise sworn to her father was about to be fulfilled. But power is not won on parchment or battlefields alone. It must also be held in hearts. And here Matilda faltered. From the moment she entered Westminster, her rule bore the iron edge of command, but little of grace. She imposed heavy levies on London's merchants, demanding gold to fuel her war. When bishops or nobles sought her ear, she dismissed them with cold authority, reminding them that she was the emperor's widow and Henry's daughter. The chroniclers, often men suspicious of a woman wielding such unbending power, wrote that she was too proud, too haughty, too imperious. Whether truth or slander, the perception took root. She was a ruler to be feared, not loved. The people of London, who had cheered her entry, soon turned restless. Whispers spread. Was she a liberator or a tyrant in waiting? The fragile loyalty of the capital cracked. Meanwhile, a formidable rival rose to oppose her, Queen Matilda of Boulogne, Stephen's wife. Unlike her stern and uncompromising namesake, Queen Matilda tempered resolve with diplomacy. She rallied the Londoners, appealing to their fears of harsh taxation and promising stability under her husband's return. She called upon mercenaries and loyal nobles, gathering strength where the Empress only demanded obedience. Then came the fateful day. As Empress Matilda prepared for her coronation, the bells of London did not toll in joy, but in alarm. The citizens, inflamed by anger and fear, rose against her. Shouts rang through the streets, stones flew, and armed men surged. What should have been her crowning glory turned into a panicked flight. Matilda, the would-be queen, fled the city under cover of night, her triumph slipping away with every hurried step. Her fortunes continued to sour. At Winchester, as her forces clashed with loyalists of Stephen, disaster struck. Robert of Gloucester, her half-brother and greatest champion, was captured. Without him, her military strength crumbled, and so, in a bitter exchange, the two sides agreed to trade captives, Robert for Stephen. The reversal was complete. Within months, the king once in chains now rode free, while the woman who had nearly claimed the throne stood diminished, her support ebbing. The war dragged on, bitter and inconclusive. Castles still burned, villages still suffered, but the moment of decisive victory had passed. For Matilda, the dream of the crown receded like a vision glimpsed and lost. Her pride, her inflexibility, her inability to charm where she could command all these, had turned allies into skeptics and skeptics into enemies. She would never wear the crown of England. And yet, though her cause had faltered, her legacy was not yet extinguished. In the son she bore, Henry, there remained a spark. A boy who would one day take the lessons of his mother's struggle and forge them into a kingship stronger than either Stephen's or Matilda's. The War of the Anarchy was not yet done. The final act was still to come. How long can a kingdom survive in twilight, neither wholly ruled nor wholly free? By the mid-1140 seconds, England was weary. For nearly 2 decades, the land had known little but siege and famine, shifting loyalties and smouldering ruins. Chroniclers spoke of fields left untilled, churches desecrated, villages abandoned. It was said, with bitter brevity, that Christ and his saints slept. King Stephen still clung to his throne, but his authority was a hollow shell. His reign, once full of bold promises, was weakened by endless conflict and the erosion of trust. He fought bravely, sometimes recklessly, yet victory always slipped from his grasp. No battle secured him final dominion. No treaty could silence the claim of the rival he had once captured. As for Empress Matilda, her star had dimmed. She withdrew to Normandy, where she governed with dignity, but without the crown she had sought. Yet she had not laboured in vain, for in her son, Henry Plantagenet, the cause of the Angevin dynasty found new life. Henry was a youth of striking energy, fiery, ambitious, and unyielding. Unlike his mother, he possessed not only authority but also charm, not only determination but a willingness to bend when needed. In 1153, he crossed into England with a fresh army, his presence breathing new life into a tired conflict. Where Matilda had often inspired fear, Henry stirred admiration. And fate, at last, shifted. Stephen's son and heir, Eustace, died suddenly that year, struck down, some whispered, by divine hand. With his dynasty weakened, Stephen could no longer afford endless war. In a moment of clarity, he met Henry to negotiate. What had once seemed impossible became reality, the Treaty of Winchester. Stephen would remain king for the rest of his days, but Henry would succeed him as heir to the throne. So it was that, when Stephen died in 1154, the boy Matilda had once carried in obscurity became Henry II of England, the first of the great Plantagenet kings. His reign would restore order, expand power, and set the stage for centuries of English history. And what of Matilda herself? She never wore the crown, but her struggle was not wasted. She was the bridge between dynasties, the iron will that ensured her son's inheritance. Without her defiance at Arundel, at Lincoln, at London, at Winchester, the Plantagenet Empire might never have been born. History remembered her with ambivalence, proud, imperious, unbending. Yet also with admiration, a woman who, in an age of men, dared to fight for a throne and nearly won it. She had walked the line between triumph and ruin, and though she stumbled, her legacy endured in the kings who followed. The anarchy had ended, but its lesson echoed through the ages. Crowns are not merely won on the battlefield. They are forged in endurance, in vision, in the relentless belief that tomorrow can still be claimed. And so the tale closes. The empress who never reigned became the mother of kings. The war that tore England apart gave birth to a dynasty. And from the ashes of famine, betrayal, and fire rose the Plantagenet's heirs, not only of thrones, but of a woman's unyielding will.